Black girls like you should be grateful to even be here." The words didn't just land. They sliced clean through the low hum of conversation, through the soft jazz floating in the air, through the delicate clink of crystal glasses that cost more than a week's rent. For a split second, everything paused. Forks hovered midair. A server near the bar stopped pouring wine. Even the chandelier light seemed to hold its breath. Naomi Carter stood still, a single tray balanced effortlessly in her hand, posture straight, expression unreadable. She didn't flinch. Not when the man leaned back in his chair with that polished, practiced arrogance. Not when a few quiet chuckles rippled around the table, the kind people give when they don't want to be involved but don't want to challenge power either. Naomi had seen that look before. The half-smile, the dismissive glance, the assumption. She moved forward anyway, placing the glass down with precision, so soft it barely made a sound. No trembling, no hesitation, just control. The kind of control you only learn after years of being underestimated. The man watched her, amused now, like he had just proven something to himself. "You people should learn your place," he added, swirling the amber liquid in his glass like the room belonged to him. Naomi's fingers tightened for the briefest second around the edge of her tray. So quick most would miss it. But not everyone in the room was looking away. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a column of polished marble, a man sat alone. No entourage, no noise. Just a quiet presence wrapped in a tailored suit that didn't need to show off to be noticed. His eyes had been on the exchange from the beginning. Watching, listening, measuring. Naomi turned slightly, ready to step away, to let the moment pass like so many others had before. Because sometimes survival wasn't about speaking. Sometimes it was about choosing when not to. But the man at the table wasn't finished. "Hey," he called out, snapping his fingers, not even looking directly at her now. "Next time, try smiling. That's what you're here for." The sound echoed sharper than it should have. A snap that didn't just demand service, it demanded submission. Naomi paused, just for a heartbeat. Then she turned back, her voice calm, steady, almost quiet enough to disappear. "Sir, I am smiling." It wasn't defiance. It wasn't anger. It was something else. Something heavier. Something that made the air shift in a way no one could quite explain. A few heads turned. A few eyes widened. And in the corner, the man who had been silent this entire time slowly set his glass down. The sound was small. Almost nothing. But it carried. Because power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. The silence did not break all at once. It unraveled slowly. Like tension slipping from a wire pulled too tight. A chair shifted somewhere near the window. A glass touched the table with a soft click. But no one returned to their conversation. Not yet. Because something had changed. Something subtle but undeniable. Naomi felt it before she saw it. The way the air seemed to lean in a different direction. The way attention moved not toward the man who had been speaking the loudest, but toward the one who had said nothing at all. She did not turn immediately. She had learned that too. That power often reveals itself in the pause, not the reaction. The man at the table scoffed under his breath, misreading the shift. "See, that is what I am talking about," he said, louder now, trying to reclaim the room. "Attitude like that does not belong in a place like this." A few forced laughs followed, thinner this time, uncertain. Naomi held her posture, tray steady, eyes calm, but inside, something sharper was forming. Not anger, not fear, something clearer, the kind of clarity that comes when you realize the moment is no longer just about survival. Across the room, the man in the corner stood, not quickly, not dramatically, just a measured movement. But it drew attention like a magnet. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned fully now. Recognition spreading in quiet waves. A name not spoken, but understood. Alexander Hayes did not rush. He walked with the kind of certainty that did not need to prove itself. Each step deliberate, controlled, until he reached the edge of the table. The man who had been speaking shifted in his seat, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. Then something else, something closer to calculation. "Can I help you?" he asked, trying to keep his tone even, but it wavered just slightly. Alexander did not answer right away. His gaze moved past him, landing first on Naomi. Just for a second, not with pity, not with surprise, but with recognition, as if acknowledging something already known. Then he looked back at the man, and when he spoke, his voice was not loud. but it carried through the entire room. "I have been listening," he said. Simple, direct, no performance. The words settled heavier than any raised voice could have. The man straightened, attempting a small laugh. "Well, I hope you enjoyed the show," he replied, forcing confidence, just giving some feedback. A few people glanced away, uncomfortable now, because the tone had shifted again. This was no longer entertainment. This was exposure. Alexander tilted his head slightly, as if considering the statement, then said, "Feedback requires understanding." A pause, measured, precise, and respect. The word hung in the air, not as an accusation, but as a standard. Naomi remained still, but her breath slowed. Steadier now, because the moment had crossed a line, and everyone in the room could feel it. The man opened his mouth to respond, but stopped, just for a second, because for the first time that night, he was no longer the one controlling the conversation, and somewhere between that realization and the silence that followed, the balance of power shifted completely. The man tried to recover his composure, straightening his jacket as if fabric alone could restore control. "Look, I think this is being blown out of proportion," he said, forcing a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "We are all just having a conversation here." But no one answered him, not the guests, not the staff, not even the quiet hum of the room that had once masked everything. Because now every sound felt deliberate. Every movement watched. Alexander Hayes did not move closer. He did not need to. His presence had already filled the space the man thought he owned. "A conversation," Alexander repeated, not mocking, not loud, just precise, as if testing the weight of the word. Then he glanced briefly around the room, at the faces pretending not to stare, at the ones who had laughed earlier, now suddenly interested in their plates. "Conversations reveal more than intentions," he continued. "They reveal character." The sentence landed softly, but it did not fade. It stayed. Pressing into the silence that followed, Naomi stood exactly where she had been, but something about her posture had shifted, not physically, but perceptibly. The stillness now carried something else, something seen. The man let out a small breath, almost a laugh. "With all due respect," he began, leaning forward slightly, trying to reclaim authority through tone. "I am a paying guest. I expect a certain level of service that includes attitude." There it was again, the assumption that money translated into permission, into hierarchy, into something more than a transaction. Alexander's gaze did not harden, it clarified, like glass. "Coming into focus, service," he said, "is not submission." The words were simple, but they cut through every excuse the man was building. A server near the bar exhaled quietly. Someone at another table shifted in their seat, the entire room leaning into a truth most people preferred not to say out loud. The man's fingers tapped once against the table, a small, restless movement. "You are making this personal," he said, his voice tightening just enough to betray him. Alexander shook his head. Once, slow, measured, "No," he replied. "You already did." And for a moment, that was all there was. No music, no laughter, just the weight of a line drawn clearly in a room that had been pretending not to see it. Naomi's eyes lowered briefly to the tray in her hands, then lifted again, steady, grounded, because this was not just about her anymore. It was about something larger, something unfolding in real time. The kind of moment that does not ask permission before it changes everything. Alexander reached into his jacket, not hurried, not dramatic, and placed a single card on the table. Black, minimal, unmistakable, the kind of detail that did not need explanation. But still, the man looked at it, then back at him, confusion giving way to realization in slow, uncomfortable layers. And that was when the room shifted again, not because of what was said, but because of what was understood, that the balance he had relied on, the quiet advantage he assumed was permanent, had never belonged to him at all. The card did not shine. It did not carry gold edges or loud branding. But it did something far more powerful. It silenced the last trace of confidence left on the man's face. His eyes flicked down to it again, slower this time, reading what was already clear, then back up at Alexander Hayes, as if hoping there had been some mistake, some misunderstanding that could still be corrected. But there was none. The room felt smaller now, tighter, like the walls themselves had leaned in to witness what came next. A woman at a nearby table subtly lowered her phone, though it had already captured more than enough. The man cleared his throat, adjusting his posture again, but the movement lacked conviction. "I did not realize," he began, carefully choosing each word, as if precision alone could undo what had already been said. "That this was your establishment." Alexander did not respond immediately. He simply looked at him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with something far more unsettling, clarity. "It was always my establishment," he said finally, calm. "Even. You just chose to notice now." A faint ripple moved through the room. Not laughter, not quite. More like the sound of people recognizing a truth they had been ignoring. Naomi remained still, but now there was a shift in how she was seen, not as background, not as service, but as presence. The man forced a small nod, trying to gather what dignity he could salvage. "Then I apologize," he said, the words landing awkwardly, incomplete, as if they had been rehearsed too late. Alexander's gaze did not soften. "An apology is not a transaction," he replied. "You do not offer it when the balance changes." The sentence settled heavier than anything before it, because it stripped away the performance, leaving only intent exposed. The man's hand moved slightly on the table, fingers pressing against the surface as if searching for something stable. But there was nothing left to hold on to. Not the laughter, not the control, not even the assumption that had carried him through the night. Across the room, the staff stood quieter, straighter, watching a moment they rarely saw unfold, not because it never happened, but because it was rarely acknowledged. Alexander shifted his attention briefly toward Naomi again, and this time, there was a subtle nod, small, almost imperceptible, but it carried weight, recognition without spectacle, respect without announcement. Naomi met his gaze for a fraction of a second, then lowered her eyes again, not out of submission, but out of choice, because dignity does not need to prove itself when it is already present. The man exhaled slowly, the room waiting, suspended between what had been and what would follow, and in that pause, something irreversible settled into place, not loud, not dramatic, but final, like a door closing without a sound. The room did not return to normal, not after that, because moments like this do not simply pass. They settle, they reshape the way people see each other, the way they see themselves, and most of all, the way they measure power. The man sat there for a second longer than he should have, as if standing too quickly would confirm what everyone already knew, that he had lost something he did not even realize he was risking. Not money, not status, but control, the illusion of it. He finally pushed his chair back, slow, deliberate, the sound echoing sharper than before, but this time no one turned to look at him with admiration, only awareness. He reached for his jacket, smoothing it over his shoulders, trying to rebuild a version of himself that no longer fit the room. "I think it is best if I leave," he said, his voice measured, but thinner now, stretched by something unfamiliar, accountability. Alexander Hayes did not block him, did not raise his voice, did not need to. "That would be appropriate," he replied, calm, final, no anger, just decision, the kind that does not invite negotiation. The man hesitated for half a second, as if expecting more, perhaps a second chance, perhaps a softer ending, but none came. "Because respect is not something you recover in the same moment you abandon it." He nodded once, a gesture meant to close the situation, but it did not close anything. It only marked the end of his presence in a space he thought he owned. As he turned and walked toward the exit, the room did not follow him with their eyes. They let him go quietly, because the story had already moved on. It was no longer about him. It had shifted, completely, back toward the center of something far more important. Naomi Carter. She stood exactly where she had been, but now the space around her felt different, not because she had changed, but because everyone else finally saw what had always been there. A manager approached slowly, unsure whether to speak, but Alexander lifted a hand slightly, stopping him without a word. Because some moments do not need interference, they need recognition. Alexander stepped closer, not too close, just enough to close the distance that had never really existed. "What is your name?" he asked, not because he did not know, but because saying it matters. Naomi met his eyes, steady, grounded. "Naomi Carter," she replied, her voice calm. the same tone she had carried through everything. No bitterness, no performance, just truth. Alexander nodded once, committing it not to memory, but to acknowledgement. Naomi, he repeated. And in that simple act, something shifted again, because names, when spoken with respect, restore what moments like earlier try to take away. He glanced briefly around the room, at the guests who were now watching with a different kind of attention, then back to her. Thank you, he said, and it was not for service, not for the tray, not for the job. It was for something else entirely, something rarer, something the room had just been reminded of. Naomi did not smile, not in the way the man had demanded earlier, but there was something in her expression now, something quiet, steady, unshaken, because dignity does not arrive when it is given, it is revealed when it is tested, and tonight, everyone had seen it. The room slowly exhaled, but it did not return to what it was before, because something invisible had shifted beneath the surface, something that could not be reset by music or conversation. Naomi stepped back with quiet precision, resuming her place in motion, not as an escape, but as a continuation, because dignity does not pause after it is seen. It continues as if it was always there. She moved between tables, her steps measured, her posture unchanged, but now the eyes that followed her were different, softer, aware. A guest who had barely noticed her earlier now straightened as she approached, offering a quiet thank you that carried more weight than it should have, and she nodded, not lingering, not absorbing it, just moving forward, because she had learned long ago that respect, when it finally arrives, should not distract you from who you already are. Across the room, Alexander remained where he stood for a moment longer, watching not just Naomi, but the ripple effect of what had just unfolded, the staff standing a little taller, the guests speaking a little quieter, the space itself recalibrating around something more honest. He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping the room, not in inspection, but in reflection, as if measuring something beyond profit, beyond performance, something closer to culture, to values, to what a place becomes when people forget that every role in it carries weight. He walked slowly toward the bar, each step unhurried, intentional. A manager approached again, cautious this time. Sir, should we prepare a statement for the guests? He asked softly, unsure whether the moment required explanation. Alexander shook his head once. No, he replied. They already heard it. And that was the point. Because some lessons do not need announcements. They need silence to settle into understanding. The manager nodded and stepped back, recognizing that the most powerful message had already been delivered without a microphone. Naomi reached the service station, placing her tray down for a brief second, her fingers relaxing just enough to release the tension she had held. Not visible, not dramatic, just real. Another server beside her glanced over, eyes wide. Are you okay? She whispered. The question gentle, sincere. Naomi gave a small nod. I am, she said, and she meant it, not because nothing had happened, but because she had remained exactly who she chose to be through all of it, and that mattered more than anything said to her. Alexander watched this exchange from a distance, not intruding, not interrupting, but understanding something deeper now, that strength does not always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like composure, like restraint, like knowing your value without needing to declare it. He picked up a glass of water from the bar, not to drink, but to hold, as if grounding himself in the simplicity of the moment. Then he set it back down, untouched, because his attention was not on the glass. It was on what came next, not for him, but for her, for Naomi, because moments like this are not endings. They are beginnings disguised as interruptions, and somewhere between the quiet footsteps, the softened voices, and the steady rhythm of service, resuming, a new narrative had already begun to take shape, one where being seen was no longer optional, and respect was no longer negotiable. The rhythm of the restaurant returned, but it was not the same rhythm. It was steadier now, more aware, as if every movement carried intention. Naomi stepped back onto the floor, her pace even, her focus clear, but something subtle followed her now, not attention in the usual sense, not curiosity, but recognition, the kind that lingers quietly. A couple at table 12 straightened as she approached, their voices softer, their words chosen more carefully. Thank you, Naomi, the woman said, using her name as if it had always mattered. and Naomi nodded once, placing their plates with the same precision as before, unchanged, because respect does not alter who you are, it reveals who others choose to be. Across the room, Alexander Hayes moved again, not toward the center this time, but along the edges, observing without interruption. His presence no longer a disruption, but a standard. The manager walked beside him briefly, lowering his voice. "Sir, the board will want to know about this," he said. Careful, measured, Alexander did not slow his pace. "Then they will hear about it," he replied, exactly as it happened. Because truth, when left intact, carries more weight than any polished version of it. The manager nodded, understanding that this was not a situation to be reshaped, but one to be remembered. Naomi reached another table. A group of men in tailored suits, the kind who earlier might have spoken over her, now paused as she approached. One of them pulled his chair in slightly, making space. A small gesture, almost insignificant, but it spoke volumes. She placed their drinks down, her hands steady, her expression calm, and for a moment, there was silence again, not uncomfortable, but respectful, as if the room itself had learned something it could not unlearn. In the distance, the front doors opened briefly, a cool night breeze slipping in before closing again, carrying with it the faint echo of the man who had left, already fading into irrelevance, because the story had moved beyond him. It had outgrown the moment he tried to control. Alexander stopped near the center of the room, turning once more, his eyes finding Naomi again, not by accident, but by intention. He watched how she moved, how she spoke, how she held herself in a space that had tried, even briefly, to reduce her. And he understood something clearly now, something that no report, no meeting, no metric could capture, that the strength of a place is not measured by its revenue, but by how it treats the people who keep it alive. He took a slow breath, then stepped toward her, closing the distance not as a superior, but as someone. Acknowledging what had already been proven, Naomi noticed him approaching, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, because this moment, like the others, did not require performance. It required presence. He stopped just short of her, not interrupting her work, waiting until she finished placing the final glass on the table, and only then did he speak, his voice calm, grounded, carrying none of the tension from before. "Naomi," he said again, her name no longer just recognition, but respect, and, in that single word, the entire room seemed to listen, because sometimes, the most powerful shift is not in what is taken away, but in what is finally given its rightful place. Naomi did not answer immediately, not because she was unsure, but because she understood the weight of a moment like this. She finished adjusting the placement of the final glass, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the table, then turned to face him fully, her posture straight, her expression calm, the same composure she had carried from the very beginning. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice steady, not formal out of fear, but out of habit, the kind built over years of navigating rooms that rarely saw her first. Alexander studied her for a brief second, not evaluating, not judging, but recognizing something that had been there long before tonight. "How long have you been working here?" he asked, the question simple, but intentional. Naomi answered without hesitation. 8 months, she said, her tone even, and for a moment, the number seemed to settle differently in the air, not as time served, but as time unnoticed. Alexander nodded slightly, as if confirming something to himself, and before that, he continued. Naomi paused just long enough to choose clarity over detail. "I studied information systems," she replied, and the sentence, quiet as it was, shifted the space again, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for those close enough to hear to look twice, because the narrative they had assumed no longer held. Alexander's expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened with understanding, connecting pieces that others had never bothered to see. "Why here?" he asked, not out of doubt, but curiosity rooted in respect. Naomi held his gaze, not defensive, not explaining herself, just answering. "Because I needed to work," she said, and that was all. No elaboration, no justification, just truth, the kind that does not require decoration. A quiet silence followed, but it was different from before. It was not tension, it was realization, the kind that expands a room rather than tightens it. Across the nearby tables, a few guests who had been listening lowered their eyes, not out of discomfort, but reflection, because suddenly the roles they had taken for granted felt incomplete. Alexander exhaled slowly, not as a reaction, but as a shift in perspective. You handled yourself with more professionalism than most executives I know, he said, and the statement did not carry flattery. It carried weight. Naomi did not smile in response, not out of indifference, but because she did not need validation to confirm what she already knew about herself. She simply nodded once, acknowledging the words without holding on to them. Alexander reached into his jacket again, not for a card this time, but for something else, a folded piece of paper. He placed it gently on the service counter beside them, not pushing it toward her, not presenting it as an offer, just leaving it there. If you are open to it, he said, his voice calm, measured, I would like you to come speak with me tomorrow. The words were simple, but the implication was not. The paper remained untouched between them, a quiet invitation, not a command. Naomi glanced at it briefly, then back at him, her expression unchanged, but something deeper moved beneath it. Not surprise, not disbelief, but consideration, the kind that comes from someone who understands the value of choice. The room held its breath again, not in shock, but in anticipation, because what came next was no longer about what had been taken from her. It was about what she would decide to do with what had just been placed in front of her. Naomi did not reach for the paper right away, not because she did not understand what it meant, but because she understood exactly what it meant, and moments like that are not rushed, they are weighed. She looked at Alexander Hayes, steady, composed, then down at the folded sheet resting quietly between them, not demanding attention, not forcing a decision, just waiting, like everything that truly matters does. The room had grown quieter again, not with tension, but with awareness, because everyone close enough had begun to realize this was no longer just about a single moment of disrespect. It was about what followed, what choices were made when the balance shifted. Naomi lifted her hand slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper before picking it up, the motion simple, controlled, as if she had done it 1,000 times before. But this time, the weight was different. She unfolded it just enough to see the name, the number, the invitation written clearly without decoration, no title, no pressure, just an opportunity. She folded it back carefully, holding it for a second longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, but out of acknowledgement. Then she placed it into the pocket of her apron, not as acceptance, not as refusal, but as possibility. Alexander watched the gesture without interrupting, without interpreting it for her, because respect also means allowing someone the space to choose their own direction. I will think about it, Naomi said finally, her voice calm, grounded, and in that sentence there was no uncertainty, only ownership, the kind that does not come from what is offered, but from knowing you have the right to decide. Alexander nodded once, not disappointed, not expecting more, because he understood that the most important part of what he had given her was not the opportunity itself, but the freedom attached to it. That is all I ask, he replied, and with that, the moment closed, not with applause, not with spectacle, but with something far more lasting, mutual respect. Naomi turned back to her work, not as someone who had been changed, but as someone who had been seen, truly seen, and the difference between those two things is everything. She moved through the restaurant with the same rhythm as before, but now the space responded differently. Chairs adjusted, voices softened, eyes met hers with a level of acknowledgement that had not existed an hour earlier, not because she had become more, but because they had finally recognized what had always been there. Across the room, Alexander stepped back, blending once again into the quiet corners, not as a man who had taken control, but as one who had simply restored balance. And as the night continued, as plates were cleared and conversations resumed, one thing remained, not loud, not visible, but undeniable. That power may enter a room with confidence, but it is dignity that decides how long it deserves to stay.